Well, good evening and welcome to our church's second conversation on race. My name is Sean Reese. I'm one of the pastors here at PBCC, and I'll be your host for the evening. If you're a visitor with us, we want to especially welcome you. This is our second conversation on race, and we have at least one more coming at the end of October. If you did not see the first one, this one can stand on its own. However, there may be references throughout the evening to that first conversation we had a month or so ago. So you don't need to, you wouldn't have had to have seen the first one, but you may hear some references throughout the evening. So why are we doing this? Why are we having these conversations? Well, as Christians, we want to imitate Jesus. At least imitate him as best as we can. And what did Jesus do? Well, first, when people were hurting, Jesus listened, especially to marginalized people. He ate with outcasts, sinners, prostitutes, the marginalized. And as you PBCCers know, I'm in the middle of preaching through John. And in John, we see Jesus have these long, drawn-out conversations with people as he listens to them, as he hears their questions, as he hears their pain. Of course, I primarily think of the woman at the well, a marginalized woman, an outcast. Jesus probed a bit, but he listened as she shared her pain. Secondly, he did this because he was full of compassion. When people were hurting, when people were marginalized, Jesus, over and over again in the Gospels, is said to be torn up inside with compassion. He suffered with hurting people. As a church, we want to imitate that. And thirdly, compassion results in action. Jesus, the ultimate light of the world, yet he also calls us to reflect his light and reflect his love into this world. We are having this conversation so we can discuss how we can be lights in the middle of this difficult situation, imitating our Savior and Lord, Jesus Christ. Jesus listened, Jesus had compassion, and Jesus brought light into a dark world. And may we, after our conversation tonight, be better listeners, have more compassion, and shine brighter because of this conversation. So this is why we're doing it. How are we going to do this tonight? Well, first of all, we do want this to be a conversation. In order for it to be a conversation, it must be safe. Why did the woman at the well share her pain? Well, because she discovered that Jesus was a safe person. In the same way, we want this space tonight to be safe for all. We all know this is challenging, emotional, and uncomfortable for all of us. And so I would ask that we all enter into tonight with empathy, with humility, seeking to listen and learn more tonight. Now, the plan for the evening will be this. Unlike last time, we do not have a handout for you. You may want to grab a pen and a notebook to take some notes, but the plan for the evening will be similar to the first one, where Bernard will kick us off with a teaching, about 20 minutes. His talk is, why should we care? Then we'll hear a story. We have one story from a good friend, a longtime friend of PBC. We'll then take a 10-minute break, and then we'll have a Q&A. And just like our previous events, you can text or email questions for the Q&A at any time. There's no chat feature for this video, and the number to send questions in, to text questions in, or to email questions are there under your YouTube video. Joel is standing by to receive your questions. You can send them at any time. Now, also note that during the Q&A, our friends from the first conversation, Chris and Caitlin and Daryl, will be with us for the Q&A as part of the panel. So if you have questions that you've been thinking about since that first conversation, you can bring them up for them tonight. We hope to end by 9 o'clock, and we'll see how this goes. So hopefully that gets us ready for our conversation tonight. Let me pray, and we'll turn it over to Bernard. Well, Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you that you are good. We thank you that your steadfast love endures forever. We thank you for the gift of your Son, who has made you known, who has shown your love, your grace, your mercy and compassion to us in a real life, in flesh. Fill us with your presence tonight. Give us all a spirit of humility, and keep us united through your powerful Holy Spirit. And we lift up Bernard as he comes to teach us. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, now I'll invite Bernard to come and teach us. Bernard, our biblical studies pastor.
Thank you, Sean, for those words of introduction and for that prayer. Well, good evening, everybody. In episode 1 of our conversation on race, which we had 7 weeks ago on July the 12th, I gave a talk on the topic of Black Lives Matter. Can we even say Black Lives Matter? And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how do you distinguish between Black Lives Matter with small letters and Black Lives Matter as the movement? And there is a distinction between them. We are not endorsing the Black Lives Matter movement. There is much in their philosophy that we disagree with. There is a reason why they hold the views that they hold. And I understand that. I just don't agree with that. And most Christians would not agree with that. But here we're talking about Black Lives Matter. Just can we affirm that Black Lives Matter? And most of the protesters who are out on the streets are not endorsing the movement. They're marching out in solidarity with the state of Black lives in America today. So what I hope is that without denying that all lives matter, that unborn lives matter, and without affirming all that the Black Lives Matter movement stands for, we can indeed say Black Lives Matter. And in that talk last month, I devoted just a minute to give some reasons as to why we should care. And so what I'm going to do tonight is expand on that topic, and in doing so, address some of the common questions that have come up in the intervening 7 weeks. This is a difficult conversation for many people, and many people do have questions, and part of us calling it a conversation is we want to encourage those questions and take the time to address them. So why should we care? So the first reason I gave as to why we should care is because of justice, both civil justice and biblical justice. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is this even a justice issue? Is this Black Lives Movement and the protests and everything, is it even about justice? So to answer that question, I have to ask, what is justice in general, and how does it relate to this particular matter? So I'm going to say a few things first about civil justice, and then about biblical justice, and how we look at the current situation. So first of all, looking at civil justice. So much of the structure of Black slavery was built upon laws and edicts, and therefore, It was lawful. So in a sense, it was just. Justice was being done with the enforcement of those laws. The European enslavement of Black Africans was legalized by 3 papal bulls in the 15th century. And these were edicts issued by the Pope in the name of Christ to the rulers of Portugal and Spain. And then Black slavery in America was defined by laws in the individual colonies beginning in the 17th century. Laws which, for example, define slaves as property, as chattel, and not as persons. So that was legal. The Declaration of Independence states that, quote, all men are created equal, but the Naturalization Act of 1790 clarified that all men really meant free white persons of good character. And by the eve of the Civil War, the nature of America seemed to be settled. This is what America is. America was white and would always be white. Blacks were slaves and would always be slaves. And as I said 7 weeks ago, this was legal, it was constitutional, it was scientific, it was biblical, it was Christian, it was intentional and perpetual. So it was legal and constitutional, but did that make it just? Was justice served? Now, we all distinguish between different types of justice. Something may be legal, but some at the time and others later on may recognize it as being unjust, that it was a travesty of justice, even though it was done under a law. And in the area of race and ethnicity, this has often been true. The Civil War was fought over states' rights, but it was over their rights to continue a system that was legal in the South, but which the North had come to consider was unjust. So on which side did justice lie? With the legality in the South, or with, as it were, the conscience in the North that wanted to change things and was changing things? Well, after the Civil War, the 3 constitutional amendments sought to redress what had come to be considered the injustice of the Constitution. And to change the Constitution, you had to pass amendments and get them ratified by the states. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship to Blacks, and the 15th extended the vote to Blacks. And this was an endeavor to incorporate within the idea of America, the Black people as human beings, as citizens, as people eligible to vote, and who would not be enslaved. But after the 20-year period of Reconstruction ended, the Southern states created what came to be known as the Jim Crow laws, the era of segregation. And this was legal. It was all passed in the legislatures of the states, but was it just? Because the effect, indeed, the intent of these laws was to impede the implementation of the 13th and 15th Amendments. Therefore, one can say that it was unjust. Therefore, the civil rights movement protesting the Jim Crow laws, protesting segregation, was a matter of justice. They were seeking to overturn laws which they considered to be unjust. So which side was justice? Now, these laws were dismantled by the civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And yet impediments continue to be placed even today in the way of the implementation of this legislation and of the 13th and the 15th Amendments. So wherever voting is hindered, the intent of the 15th Amendment and of the Voting Rights Act is being frustrated. The mass incarceration of Black men has been called the new Jim Crow. It is legal, but is it just and right? So when legislation disproportionately and negatively affects one community, one set of people over against another, then it is legitimate to raise the issue of justice. And that's our situation today. And the fact that so many encounters between Black men and police officers end in death is a matter of grave concern. And the shooting this week of Jacob Blake in the back 7 times is just the latest example. And we know about these now because they're being captured on cell phones by onlookers, bystanders. And it's this video evidence that really has launched the BLM protests and continue to launch new waves of protest, as we've seen this week. The fact that the mass incarceration of the last 25 or 30 years ends up with 1/3 of Black men cycling through the prison system, a far higher percentage than any other ethnic group, suggests we have a problem of justice. Indeed, the fact that the US prison population is so very high compared to any other country suggests that perhaps we have a justice problem there, even although all of this is done legally, under laws, under justice, under the criminal justice system. But is it really justice? So I had some few thoughts about the area of civil justice. And here we have to ask, why the focus on Blacks? Again, this is a question that gets asked often. Surely all lives matter, unborn lives matter, blue lives matter, indeed, but why are we particularly talking of Blacks? Well, over the last 150 years or so, there have been other racial injustices against various ethnic groups. But in nearly all of those cases, corrective action has been taken. There has been a recognition that it was wrong, and it has been corrected. So for example, the late 19th century, the Chinese were excluded in the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then Chinese who were in the country at one point in the late 19th century were stripped of their citizenship. It took a while, but finally, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act were repealed, and Chinese, the ethnic Chinese, are incorporated into the country. And here in the Bay Area, we have a great concentration of ethnic Chinese, and they play a full part in the economy and are able to participate fully in the life of America. Perhaps in some areas, you would still find some Asian discrimination. Have a friend who moved to Mississippi and certainly encountered that back in the 90s. But generally, certainly here in California, that is not an issue that is faced any longer. Then we have the example of the Japanese, who in World War II were stripped of their property, stripped of their rights, and locked away in internment camps. Now, there was a reason why that happened. There was a tremendous fear in the country, fear of the Japanese. These were all loyal US citizens. And eventually it was realized that that was a travesty of justice. And an apology was made and reparations were made. And those reparations were essentially a nominal figure. They couldn't begin to make up for the economic damage that was done by that internment. But it was a very significant symbolic act of issuing the apology and setting aside, I think it was $1 billion to just, as it were, and it was more than simply a token. It was really a strong expression of that apology and regret over what had happened. Then we had the Jews who were discriminated against in the early 20th century, and who, along with the Blacks, were excluded from a lot of aspects of life. As Brian often mentions, his father was a member of a country club that excluded Blacks and Jews, and that was quite common all over the country. So Jews were excluded, and then Southern Europeans were excluded, the Italians and the Irish earlier in the 20th century. Firstly, they were Catholic, and they were not the right sort of white European. The Italians weren't really white. So there was discrimination about those ethnic groups. But the tide changes It's now cool to be Jewish or Italian or Irish heritage. But the one constant through all of this, and it's been a constant for 400 years, is the treatment of the Black community, which has been discriminated against, which for a long time was treated as less than human, as non-human, back when it was chattel, was denied all sorts of rights, and for whom consistently there have been efforts to marginalize and exclude from full participation in society. So this is why we're talking about the Black community. It is a matter of justice, of civil justice. If we have this vision that America is the country of all of its citizens and that they should thrive. Moving on to biblical justice. What is the Bible's concept of justice? Well, the Old Testament has a lot to say on this topic. And in Israel, it was the king who was responsible for setting the tone of the nation. And so we read in 2 Samuel 8 concerning David that David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. And then in 1 Kings chapter 10, when the Queen of Sheba came to visit, she was effusive in what she said to Solomon. She said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness." So God's intent was for the king to do justice and righteousness for all the people. Justice and righteousness is a common word pair in the Old Testament. Now, we have to be conscious of how we hear these words in the 21st century as Christians, because we tend to hear them through legal forensic ears. Righteousness, that has to do with our state of salvation, that we stand justified before God, or maybe take the view that Christ's righteousness has been imputed to us. And so it's me as an individual and my standing before God. But in the Old Testament, these two words have quite a different meaning to them. To do justice, the Hebrew word mishpat, means to maintain community order and to restore it if it is fractured. Now, unfortunately, we now hear the word order as law and order, which is to impose some laws or to prevent rioting or something like that. But in the Bible, order is shalom, which is often translated peace, but a richer word than that, really, meaning something like well-being or flourishing. So I tend to use the word flourishing to translate shalom. And I used the word order a number of times this morning in my sermon. I was a little cautious in doing that, very aware that at this time, people will hear it in terms of law and order. But I was talking about the order that God brings to our lives. And here, it's the order that the king, as God's representative, can bring to the life of Israel. Righteousness. Righteousness means reciprocal faithfulness and loyalty in relationship. So it is behavior within a relationship. It is being loyal and acting in the appropriate way for that relationship. Or as Sean often reminds us, it is right relatedness. And so the first time we get this word is in Genesis 15:6, where Abram believed the Lord and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's not so much that Abram was justified before God, but that Abraham's response to God was the appropriate response given the relationship they were in. God as the sovereign, Abraham as it were, the subject. And the appropriate response in that was God made a promise and Abraham believed it. He took God at his word, considered God reliable, and that was the appropriate response. Therefore, he was acting in righteousness. So justice, righteousness, shalom, all three of these words have to do with the proper functioning of society so that all flourish. So this was a vision for Israel. This was a vision for Israel's kings. So it worked with David and Solomon, although Solomon, it began to fray a little around the edges. And then sadly, the kings of Israel and Judah quickly stopped doing this. And instead of maintaining a flourishing society, the rich and powerful oppressed the weak and the marginalized, the poor, the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner. And we saw that this morning in the passage that I read from Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, justice, righteousness, and shalom, thinking of that today and what these three words represent, we would think of this as social justice. This was God's design for Israel, which was in turn to be a pattern for the whole world. It is a more expansive view of justice than just law keeping. It is about the flourishing and well-being of society. Now, in the New Testament, the Christians saw themselves as one family. And so they cared for the entire family, which crossed all ethnic divisions, socioeconomic divisions, gender divisions. They took care of the widows. When the church in Jerusalem was suffering under a famine, they sent a koinonia gift to the church to relieve their poverty. A koinonia gift, a gift of participation, a gift of fellowship, saying, we are in this with you. We care for you. Here's our love gift to you, our brothers and sisters. And then we've seen in my series on Thessalonians that Paul praises them for their work produced by faithfulness to Jesus, their labor prompted by their love for one another. And the Christians extended their love beyond even the Christian family. So, for example, when the plague repeatedly swept through the Roman Empire, it was the Christians who looked after the sick. The healthy pagans ran away out to the country. The Christians stayed behind and cared for the sick. And sometimes they died. But they persevered in doing that because of their hope. They were inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. And their belief that he would come back and that there would be a resurrection. Therefore, it didn't matter if they died. Certainly, if you're reading the end of 1 Thessalonians, you have this reassurance from Paul that those who have died in the Lord will be raised. So that's a little vision of justice in Israel and justice in the church. Question, should the church today engage in social justice? This question arises a lot. And the word social here is a touchy one in conservative circles, both Christian and non-Christian. So I'm very aware of that as I say that word. It raises the question for Christians is, can faith and work be reconciled? And unfortunately, we tend to oppose those two. It's either faith or work. We don't want to have any hint that perhaps we're justified by our works. And yet, 1 Thessalonians 1:3, Paul puts faith and work together. Your work that is inspired by your faithfulness, motivated by your faithfulness to Jesus. The question is, shouldn't the church just focus on the human heart and the need for it to be renewed? Again, this is a question that comes up, and it's really a perennial question, particularly in the American church. Shouldn't we just preach the gospel and get people saved? And I think really it comes out of the fundamentalist movement, and it comes out of the dispensational movement, which is we shouldn't do anything to improve society on earth because earth is just going to be destroyed when the Lord returns. And what's important is to get people saved out of this world. But over the centuries, throughout history, the church and individual Christians have engaged in acts of social justice, of seeking to be good for the world, to better the world. They've built schools, hospitals, orphanages, soup kitchens. They've engaged in acts not narrowly focused on preaching the gospel. So, for example, William Wilberforce, the end of the 18th century, a profligate young man, was converted in his 20s. And then because of his Christian faith and under the counsel of John Newton, his conscience was troubled, and he embarked on this long process of trying to get slavery, the slave trade abolished in the UK, and then slavery itself. And he labored 20 years for each of those against tremendous odds, but it was his Christian faith that propelled him to do that. And this group of people who rallied about him, the Clapham sect, who wanted to, out of their Christian convictions, wanted to make Britain a better place, a more flourishing place, and they worked with the slaves. It is Bryan Stevenson's Christian faith that motivates him to work with the incarcerated Black people down in the South, based out of Mississippi, engaging in justice issues, racial justice issues, and reversing injustice. So the Bible has this more expansive view of justice, that it is flourishing. And we have the situation here in the US where many Black communities are not flourishing. Now, it's true there are also other communities that are not flourishing. For example, the Appalachian towns that were reliant on the coal industry, or the Rust Belt cities where heavy industry has closed. One of the differences is the men of these communities were not incarcerated in high numbers, and opioid addiction is not criminalized. So Black community is flourishing, but the Black community is also facing some unique challenges that these other non-flourishing communities are not facing. And finally, on the topic of justice, I want to say just a little bit about retributive justice versus restorative justice. I mentioned this briefly in my first talk. So retributive justice is punishment for wrongdoing and leads to high incarceration rates and long mandatory prison sentences. It does nothing to seek to bring restoration to society and promote a flourishing society. And that's what restorative justice seeks to do. Seeks flourishing the other side of the wrongdoing. And I really think the US criminal justice system is particularly strong in the retributive justice. And that's largely what the public wants. But is justice really being served by that? Or would justice better be served by restorative justice? So that's my thoughts on justice. Is this a justice issue? And it is on many different levels. Now, a second reason I gave as to why we should care is compassion. It is good for us to have sympathy with and empathy for a hurting community. And it's undeniable that the Black community is hurting. Now, in the injustices, racial injustices done in the past, there was no sympathy, there was no compassion. There was no compassion for the Japanese as they were being locked up in the Second World War, just fear. There was no compassion for the Chinese when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. There was no compassion for the Jews trying to flee Europe and facing discrimination here. But we are the people of a God of compassion, who revealed himself as the Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. And then Sean has mentioned that Jesus showed great compassion, compassion to the lepers, compassion to the people that we wouldn't want to show compassion to. Dined with the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the sinners. So I think it would be good for us as Christians for our hearts to be moved in compassion. And then the third reason I gave is because of the fruit of the Spirit. That if the Spirit is at work in us, that should overflow in love, kindness, goodness, and gentleness, and how we treat others including the challenge of how we treat others that we might fear, that we treat as other, that we might find uncomfortable extending that to. And then briefly, there are impediments to caring. The biggest impediment probably, I think, is individualism. We are so used to thinking of ourselves, and this is true for America as a whole, we tend not to think, we don't want to think about the flourishing of the whole society because it's me getting ahead and prospering. And the word social is an ugly word. Thinking collectively, ensuring that society as a whole flourishes, requires putting aside our individualism. And there is fear, and we absolutely have to acknowledge this. A lot of people are just very, very afraid of Black people. They fit the profile. There is a quest for power. So justice will often involve giving up power. And then there's nostalgia for a different age, for an age long before when we were isolated from these racial issues and everything was sweet and nice, which of course is rather mythic. What about our response? People ask, what can we do? Once we accept that we should care, what should we do? Should we feel guilty? This question has come up. Now, there are some who should feel guilty. Those who participated in or were complicit in acts of racial injustice. Whether it be acts of racial injustice from back in the 60s or the 50s, those people are still alive. And in that case, one can seek to redress some of those wrongs. But most of us do not have that direct connection to the injustices suffered by the Black communities. We weren't making the laws, we weren't enacting the policies, and so on. So for most of us, I think a better response is sorrow. Sorrow over the suffering of the Black communities. Sorrow over the fact that this happened in America, that laws were passed that facilitated this, that enacted this discrimination. And then I also feel sorrow over how scripture was misused to justify slavery. So what can we do? Well, listen and learn. Listen, this is a major aspect of our conversation. Last month, we heard some stories. Tonight, we'll hear a rather different story. By listening, we see the other person. We say, I see you. I see who you are. And we give the other person the gift of being taken seriously, of having a story that matters, a story that we need to hear. We give them our attention. Jesus, as Sean pointed out, listened, full of compassion. And then we learn. And by being willing to learn, we are willing to expand and perhaps change our understanding. We express humility, that we don't know the whole story, that perhaps we grew up hearing only a partial narrative, a slanted narrative. And we learn by hearing stories. We learn, we can read books, we can watch movies such as Selma or 13th. Listening and learning may well make us uncomfortable because we will be confronted by some uncomfortable truths. And then we can learn about those who are doing something, who are in a position to do something, such as Brian Stevenson, as he describes in his book, Just Mercy, which was turned into a movie well worth watching. So what can we do? We can listen and learn. I know many of you want to get out there and be active. Many of us are not really in a position to go and do that, but that's what we are inclined to do. And if we go into action too quickly without listening and learning, we're likely to make the problem worse. So it is okay to stay in the place of listening and learning for a while. And that's what this conversation is about. So with that, it's time then to introduce our story for today. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Steve McGriff. to tell us about himself tonight. I got to know Steve back in 1988 at PBC Palo Alto. And a couple of years after that, I had the pleasure when Sue and I got married that he was one of my groomsmen. And then we had the very great pleasure that one of my groomsmen married one of Sue's bridesmaids. They did not have eyes for each other at the wedding. That happened subsequently, starting in our living room over some dinners. And Gloria Johnson, as she was at that time, was a children's director here at PBC Cupertino, or PBC South as it was. So there's long history with PBC, the PBC family of churches. And now Steve and Gloria are at Willow Glen Bible Church for the last couple of years, what was formed out of the joining together, the merger of Dwell Church and PBC Willow Glen. So that's all the introduction I'm going to give about Steve, because he is going to tell you who he is. So Steve, please tell us who you are.
Thank you, Bernard. My friends, let me compose myself, because listening to Bernard in the last 10 minutes brought tears to my eyes. Give me a moment to bring up the presentation and begin to tell you about me. Hey, look, I made a fancy name tag for you guys. See? Because this is what we do when we meet each other. We get to make name tags, and then we talk. So I invite you into a conversation with me. Let's imagine that we're meeting for the first time. And now, well, of course, you have this context that I'm about to tell you about, my perspective of standing at the intersection of race, faith, and life. But, you know, that's kind of serious. Well, let's hold off on that for a moment. Let's just get to know each other first. So here I am. Hello. This is how I typically make my name tags. I just want people to have a different reaction to me. I want them to feel happy about being in my presence. So I put a smiley face and I'll say, be happy. That's a little bit of who I am. A little bit of a provocateur, as you will see in the next few minutes. So typical process of getting to know someone is you just kind of work through some of the superficial kinds of things like, hi, how are you? What work do you do? Where do you live? What's your family life? What's your connection to this church? And the connection to the church is real important because it really is so much a part of my wife's story, whom Bernard introduced. Oh, wait, you wouldn't quite know her in her mask. Maybe this picture will bring back a memory of how you might know us from 1991. When she was the assistant director of children's ministry, do you know that she invited every single child to our wedding? The wedding list had 800 people's names on it because every parent who had a child got invited. That was us. That was my wife. Love her to death. We've been married for 29 years now. And for 24 of those years, we've had sons. What a blessing they have been. Yes, I came to Peninsula Bible Church in Palo Alto, loved it because it taught me. I liked learning about how to read the Bible. I liked what was happening with the transition to PBC South, PBC Cupertino. You see, in so many ways, in just a minute, you can see that I'm so much like you. But I don't typically call myself a Christian because that's kind of a noun. I'd rather be an action-oriented guy. So I refer to myself as a Christ follower. And then, you know, in this part of the conversation, as I imagine having this with you, you'll then ask me this next question. You know, well, what do you do for a living? Well, my profession is I'm an educator of educators. I teach teachers. It's my privilege to be part of the 2% of the US population by holding a doctorate in instructional systems. I work now as an education entrepreneur. I'm a solopreneur. I'm an independent consultant. That is my work and my viewpoint. Let me pause here for a moment, because why am I telling you that I have a doctorate? Why do I even present this really slick photograph of myself? Because for many years, I wouldn't say anything about my doctorate. I wouldn't talk about the educational institutions that I had graduated from because I always felt, well, that might sound a little arrogant. And my Christian friends or folks in church, well, they might feel uncomfortable if I were to proclaim all of those things. Now, today, new Steve, I'm just telling you facts. And if I do it well, and if I do it with humility, I can just let the weight of what I told you rest on you. And it's your interpretation of what to do with them. And it's not really my responsibility. So let's continue to get to know one another just a little bit. But maybe not. Because we get to this point of the conversation and sometimes it will shift in a direction that's a little bit unsafe. And I wonder if I'm ready to say something more. And I wonder if you're really prepared for something more. So it seems like an innocent question. Your last name is McGriff. So are you Irish? Now I typically have two choices. Do I take the safe road and say, yes? Or in the transparency of who I'm trying to be, do I take you down a path with me? You know where I'm going to go with this one. I'm going to take you down that path. Because now it gets really interesting. So yes, I am Irish. But that's only a part of the story. That's only one of the facets of who I am. I like that part, but wait just a minute. Let me imagine how you're responding to things that I've said so far. So stick with me for a moment. So as you were asking questions and I reply with something like, I'm a Christian, I imagine, as I've heard many times, people go, yeah, right on, great. Oh, and he goes to our church. Oh, look at the history that he has. And then, oh, he's a family man. Oh, I like family values. So we're warming up here. We're doing really good. And then I might tell you a story about my mother being German, and that not just that, I mean, she was German in World War II. She was a young woman, teenage girl and young woman during the war years. That's kind of interesting. And by the way, my father is Black. He's born in a small, poor town southwest of Houston in 1915. And here's what often happens. Huh? But you don't look Black. Now it gets real interesting. I'm Stephen James McGriff. I'm the son of Asbury D., who is the son of Attaway, who is the son of Reverend Prince R. McGriff, Mount Airy Missionary Baptist Church at the turn of the 20th century. And by the way, Black people don't ask each other about their last names and whether or not it has European origins. We know where our birth surnames came from. Prince R. McGriff was born a slave in Georgia in 1856. He chose to keep his master's name. But look at that man. Look at his picture. He looks like he's white. He was referenced as mulatto or colored by the white editors of the Weimar Mercury newspaper at the turn of the century. Given this legacy of fathers, I am Stephen James McGriff, born out of slavery in the United States. And I am today, I'm part of the 2% of the population that holds a PhD. Who could have imagined that story? I don't know that Prince could have done it, but I'm sure he was praying for me. So yeah, I'm Black, but I'm also mixed race. And like so many of us, how would you know if you didn't ask or I didn't tell you? And I didn't often tell you because you see, I look more white today than I did when I was a teenager. I previously had darker hair and I had a lot more of it and it was thicker and it was lightly curly. I loved my hair. It's going. When I was younger, blacks could easily identify me as black. It rarely was a question. If I saw another black person, I get the head nod. Mm-hmm. Acknowledgement that I existed. Mm-hmm. So if you didn't know that that's what that means, that's what that means. It means, brother, I see you. But whites would not often recognize the physical traits that are inherent in African Americans. And besides, I don't sound like I'm black when I speak. And until recently, I would not have told you I was black unless you were black. There's a lot of reasons for that. But for understanding those reasons, I need to take you back. Let me reflect. As I was growing up, I was part of a mixed family of 5. My father had 1 child. My mother had 2 children. One of them was mixed race. And then both my parents had my sister and I. We were middle class, just ordinary people, raised on the east side of San Jose from 1967 to 1981. Our home life was not African American. Our home life was set in a German cultural context because my father loved my mother. And my mom wanted that kind of a home. And that's what my father gave her. So look what happens. In my elementary years, I'm growing up a little bit unsure. We're not talking about race and identity. I was a quiet, sensitive, shy child. I typically felt on the outside with the neighborhood kids. In fact, my dad was the one who put the basketball hoop on our house first, but the black kids next door wouldn't let me play on my own yard with my own basketball. Pain. And then there was this. So for my darker skinned siblings, they were called Oreos. But then there was me, a little bit on the pale complected side. So what did I get to be? The vanilla Oreo chocolate on the inside. Education is the escape, because Steve was smart. His mother loved him into his smartness. Little Stephen could do no wrong. Little Stephen was excellent in school. So he goes off to high school. And I had an opportunity to become an exceptional student in high school. I loved to play ball. Education was my path around all of these social issues. I was smart, but relatively quiet. And I really lived my life trying not to upset people. I just wanted to get along with people. I just wanted them to like me. I grew up in a relatively incubated place, living in my world, in my little worldview of race. Didn't have religion as any particular context, and I didn't really know a lot about life outside my community. When it came time, to kind of be the high school student, lots of teachers loved and cared for me in ways that are still amazing to me today. And when I left high school, this is very important because the story pivots. The story pivots. When I left high school, I felt like this. I'm not black. And then life got real interesting. I showed up at Stanford University. I'm proud to own it now. It took me almost 25 years to be able to say I was a Stanford graduate. I walked back on the campus one day for a reunion a few years ago. I walked the same places I had walked before, and I wept in tears because I finally reconciled my undergraduate experience with my life, and I owned it. By God's grace. I'm still learning, folks. I'm still learning. Here's what happened at Stanford. What the heck? Everybody's smart. There's athletes everywhere. And I wasn't good enough to play baseball. Hey, wait a minute. Why are all those black kids sitting together in the cafeteria over there? What is that about? Isn't that just like them to do that? I was both afraid to find out and I was intrigued to know why. Dear friend challenged me. He says, Steve, why don't you move into the black theme house on campus? It's called Ujamaa, which means unity. In that house, there's at least 50% of the 100+ residents are black. I was a little afraid, but I did it anyway. Changed everything. Changed everything. First time in my life, all of these things came together. Respect, identity. What? I felt like an insider in the black community. They let me play basketball. And I didn't have to explain myself or hide. I emerged as someone who was respected and loved and valued. I was identified and embraced for my racial identity that I didn't even know because I didn't grow up that way. The only other Black people I knew were part of my family, and I only saw them every once in a while. I owned it. I owned it. But there was still so much to learn. There's so much to learn. People, I didn't know what I'm about to tell you until I was at Stanford. I went through classes, and I'm sitting there with my friends from the Black community. I learned about African American history. And by the way, the textbooks that you had read when you were in school, and perhaps the same ones they still use, they're just lies. They lie about the Black American experience. They're written by white scholars, and they come from a viewpoint that contains very little information, or they just give you half-truths about the African American experience. Just thought you might like to know. What about Black identity? I didn't know Black skin color mattered, whether it was shades of brown. I didn't know about hair texture. I didn't, but I learned a lot. They embraced me, they loved me, they cared for me, they accepted me as one of their own. I learned about Black heritage. Did you know that there were civilizations in Africa, like in the area of Egypt, long before Egypt, that was even greater than Egypt? Nobody talks about that. That doesn't come up in Western culture or civilization. No, we start with Egypt. A little false information there about the grandeur of Egypt. What about Black cultural norms? You know what used to upset me about Black people? Black people would like argue and yell at each other. I'd see them in the dorm. Why are they always yelling at each other, talking about each other's mothers and stuff? Man, that's upsetting. I didn't know. That's just a form of communication. There really wasn't hostility. They weren't threatening to kill each other like they said they were. That's just the way they would talk. Even I got to learn how to do that while I was there. That was pretty awesome. What else did I learn while I was there? Because I am white, after all. Here's a picture of my mother. She was German. There's my dad, the decorated Army veteran. And there's me during my time in Germany, desperately learning German and all about German culture. It began to mesh these things together. I learned about my human identity. And then, of all the things that began to happen, after I graduated from college, I discovered Jesus Christ had a whole different perspective on all of this. He identified me not because of my race, but because he loved me as someone that he made. He accepted me. And I chose to believe that race and ethnic identities just didn't matter among my Christian brothers and sisters. So I am still learning. And over these last 30 plus years of my life, I've had this growing realization that I am still learning who I am. This is why I'm here right now, talking with you. I am not the same person exactly that Bernard met in 1988. He heard parts of my story and he said, wow, that's very compelling. Would you mind talking more about it? Would you like sharing? I said, I feel a compulsion that I need to share. I feel God pulling me up here, the scruff of my neck, and saying, Steve, you've been silent way too long. Son, I need you talking. I chose to follow Jesus Christ. And I thought that took care of all the race issues, right? Because the Bible does say, after all, love God, love people. I'm people. I'm good to go. Don't have to deal with this race stuff anymore. So I'd never bring it up. I didn't show up in church talking about whether I was Black or not or whatever. Didn't have to. Didn't have to. Or so I thought. I'm continuing to try to be that man of Christ. I've got a legacy here. I've got a legacy. Those three men in that picture, Sebastian, Justin, and Ethan, are the arrows that God has given me to fire into this world, to stand up for racial equality, social injustice, to be men of God. I am learning that I do have a voice, and I'm practicing how to speak it in truth and love. I will still be me and who I am. I'm still learning. I'm awakening. And I'm awakening to an awareness, because what's happened over the last few months is the thing that God used to grab my attention, turn me upside down, shake me. I'm shook. Today, I hear my Christian friends ask the question, why do Black lives matter? What about all lives matter? Yeah, it's a great question. Bernard laid out a beautiful explanation and description. I'm a story. I have an identity. And I also have a deep faith that Jesus came to love everyone and that he calls us to love everyone in his name. So when you ask the question, do Black lives matter? Do I matter to you? Because this is who you're talking about. Black lives matter to me, mainly because of the social unrest. Now, I have been quiet for a pretty long time because, I just didn't want to upset people. I didn't want to get on their bad side. I was looking for friends. But you see, this is what happened. George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks. Every week, seems like another Black man is shot by someone who's supposed to be protecting him. I see and I feel man's inhumanity in man, but not like some disaffected news story. Oh, that's off on some other distant city. That isn't near us. That's not about me. Those aren't my people. I feel the systemic abuse and injustice of Blacks as targets of repeated egregious violence by police. Whenever I hear the next story of police brutality against Blacks, let me tell you how I feel. I suddenly find I have the inability to breathe because my esophagus feels like it's being crushed. I feel the wind being knocked out of my lungs by 7 bullets through my back. I feel a loathing for how man could be so small-minded and arrogant to believe himself greater than another man because of his skin color, because of his fear got the better of him, because of his race, his creed, or his religion. Brothers and sisters in the Lord, I'm telling you, Jesus teaches us to love one another at a very high standard. Very high standard. In conversations with white friends, I know this is puzzling to them. They're not used to seeing that Steve, because Steve hadn't been an angry Black man before. They would see me as an individual, and they'd think, oh, he's a congenial kind of guy. He's a little scholarly context, He wears the glasses. He sports the professor look. Recent days, much to my surprise, I've learned many of my white friends, many of them are Christian, do not perceive the depth of injustice and racism that I perceive over the same events. So our conversations get just as interesting as this one. On the flip side, a few of those friends who are Christian, who know that I'm Black, reached out to me. As soon as the news of another shooting happened, they started texting, sending me messenger messages, and they would say, how are you? They expressed a concern for me that deepened my love for the Lord and my love for them. So for everyone, listen carefully. The cry that Black Lives Matter is really, listen, it's really an unresolved issue of the heart until everyone can recognize it's a cry for social justice. And I believe it is a cry of the Christian church to love the Samaritans and the others as Jesus loves them. For me, flat, done. Anything less than that is oh my goodness. Why don't you just slap Jesus in the face? Why don't you just poke him with a spear in the side? To take what Jesus commanded us to do and do anything less than that is an affront. This is how outraged I feel. Let me take a moment. We'll calm down. Black Lives Matter because I matter. Reverend Prince R. McGriff matters. My cousins, my family, my friends. Now, I have not faced direct persecution or harassment because of my skin color, but I am empathetic. I love my father, I feel the pain of brothers and sisters, and it hurts. I'm woke. I've been in a 40-year slumber. I have had Christian friends say, 40 years, Steve? You know, there's significance in the Bible about 40 years. I said, what the heck? I said, yeah, do I need to remind you of Moses? He was quiet for 40 years till God called him. What you gonna do, son? I said, dang it. That compulsion from God to speak, because this is not typically what I do. I don't speak out on issues like this because, remember, I would just want you to be my friend. In my wokeness, I am still learning. But you see, what I'm learning is that by my being quiet and small, didn't serve the Lord, didn't serve my church, doesn't serve society. Living in my little comfortable, safe space, because it's comfy that way. And I want to stay like that. Why would I want to be bringing up issues of racial injustice and racial bias and unconscious bias? These are all negative. These are negative concepts. Do I have to have this conversation, Lord? My comfortable and life of quiet obedience. Living in harmony with so many white Christian brothers and sisters, and by my keeping silent, deprive them of the opportunity to hear what I have to say years ago. I can no longer be quiet. I have a pain in my heart. I hear God's command. Gotta love the others and the one another's. Jesus came with a heart of compassion. I searched the scripture just to find out, was there any instance of where Jesus was uncompassionate? I know you looked it up real quick and you can't find one. You won't. You won't. By the way, my friends, on the subject of being colorblind to racial differences, here's what I learned at Stanford. It's held true in the years then. For me, my opinion. Don't become colorblind because of racial differences. And don't tell me you don't see my race or looking at a person who really is dark-skinned black. Don't tell me you don't see their color. Because you see, what I'm going to say to you is this: that's a humanistic choice. And you did that to quiet down that uncomfortable feeling of recognizing and acknowledging that racial differences. You did that for yourself, not for the person you're talking to. You're trying to identify as a sympathizer. People of color recognize white sympathizers everywhere we go. But rather than being a sympathizer, you're actually being a pacifier. But you're pacifying yourself. In reality, to deny that you see color is to look through clouded glasses, like in this image. And you deny all of the qualities and characteristics that God has given me uniquely to shine, to be who I am. You are missing out on the full dimensions. You will be looking at people homogenized as opposed to in the full color spectrum of who God has made them to be. And in the name of transparency, is that not what we're supposed to be doing in our introductions here? Building a relationship. Transparent, not colorblind. Brothers and sisters, I'm bringing it to a close. I'm in the home stretch. I am and I am not like you. I am like you in so many ways. And then in other ways, you've just learned, Steve's not like us at all. But I'm not only black, I'm uniquely colored. I'm mixed. My kids are mixed, because Gloria is Hispanic. And I'm more than just me. I'm connected to a whole US history of racial injustices that Bernard described just a few minutes ago. There is every black person you see today emerges from that history. That's somewhere in their family. So you can't look at a person of color today and just say to them, oh, I just see you as you are today. No, there is a history that brought them to where they are and makes them who they are. I am like you in so many ways because I'm just as perplexed by misunderstandings that we have as people, where we thought friends of ours, Christian brothers and sisters, thought like us, and then we discovered they don't. Man, this is why we're having conversations. There are conversations in Willow Glen Bible Church as well that I had a privilege to speak to. I'm learning. I'm learning to be being like Jesus. I do have a message of hope. Message of hope. On the topic of race. Skin color makes a world of differences underneath, and there's stories under there. When we choose churches, clubs, and associations to belong to, we're not always in sync with the total set of group and cultural values, but we're looking to belong. So when I show up in a church, I scan. I'm scanning for other people of color. I'm trying to find out, is this a multi-ethnic church or not? Do I think I would really fit in here or not? We all have biased viewpoints. We need to learn how to adjust them so that we see better. I highly encourage us to see Blacks and other people in the light of their cultural and personal history. I have hope. I have hope for church meetings and gatherings and friendships like represented by the colors of these people's skins. I have hope for you and me. Faith, love is a verb. That's why I'm a Christ follower. I actively put myself into the act. Jesus put love into action. I am learning how to give grace and compassion. I'm learning to receive grace and compassion. I'm learning to seek understanding, but I'm learning how to say what I think I need to say. And I'm praying right now that if I've said anything to offend you, ask yourself why. And then test me to see if I said it in a way that was meant to offend you, or if it's just so startling that you can't hear God whispering to you. Pay attention. Be the person God is shaping you to be. But take a clue from Micah 6:8. Love mercy, act justly, and walk humbly. My help for you and me in life. People, friends, we got to get uncomfortable, because it's in that uncomfort that we can come together. Because in that uncomfort, we get real creative. The greatest problems in the world were solved because people didn't like the problem existing, so they found ways to solve it. That is the key to creative thinking. And if y'all know what design thinking is about, you know you're going to solve a problem with creativity because it bothers you. As Lord would have it, this passage came up in a devotional for today. And I read it this morning and I said, I got to put this in because this is where we are. I have to do this every day. I've been doing this every day for the last 4 months. Pastors in my church speak on this. We need to examine ourselves, and we need to reconcile ourselves with the Lord. My friends, you have joined me at the intersection of race, faith, and life. Thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you so much for sticking with me, because I believe I am here out of the love of Jesus. I hope that your questions will be ready and challenging and inviting me to talk more. Are you with me? Do I matter? Do you love me? Because together we are better than apart. And with that, I release control back to Sean.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you taking your time to be with us tonight. Part of our conversation. Thank you for your heart, for your passion, for your story. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Bernard, for your rich teaching. It's now time for our 10-minute break. So it's 8:15. Let's be back at 8:25. And now's your time to send in questions if you have any. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. since our first conversation. So the first question is actually to Chris and Caitlin, and it's this: did you face difficulties with your family or friends when you decided to marry outside of your race? How did your friends and family react when they found out you were getting married?
Thankfully, we, at least from my perspective, did not encounter any difficulties. My family loved Chris from the moment that they met him, and Chris's family has been completely warm and loving towards me. I think we probably surprised our parents when we told them who we were dating. I think you probably always imagine that your kid will marry somebody who looks like you or looks like them. But I think that, at least for me, being from California, there just wasn't the racial stigmas that you might expect in other regions of the country. And even though, interracial marriage was only legalized in the 60s, I think that there's been a huge shift culturally in attitudes towards interracial marriages. So at least from my perspective, it was not at all something that we got blowback at all from friends or family.
I think, so when my friends and family found out that I was engaged, they were super excited that someone had agreed to marry me. That was like the first thing. I think, so the journey, I guess maybe some context will help, as you guys heard in my story last time, my father grew up in the South. And integrated his school and really experienced a lot of abuse as the only Black child in an all-white school, and scars that he carries today. And, had experienced a lot of bias during his own medical training. And so that that never leaves you, and I think that to be quite honest, has made him concerned about how much he can trust the goodwill of white people sometimes. And so growing up, I heard from my extended family who are still in the South that, interracial couples are much more likely to end up in divorce, that society will not accept you, that because there's not much of a cultural overlap, there are going to be a lot of misunderstandings. And so, they generally were wary of it. And I think, my parents, like all parents, I think, just as Caitlin said, when you have a child, you immediately envision their future. And so I think you default to your own race, your own religion, your own culture. And so I think that was true for them too. And so that was my experience growing up. And then as I got older, I had a few people who I dated briefly, and I ended up dating Black women, white women, Asian women, and a Hispanic woman. And so I think my parents then realized that, they had no idea who I was going to end up with. And so when I told them about Caitlin, they could tell that I loved her, and that was the most important thing. And when they met her, they could tell that she loved me, which was equally important. I think as a parent, you can see how your child relates to someone else. And so that they immediately felt comfortable with her. But I will say, the first time she came to meet my family, my father said, if you're going to date a Black man, you have to understand the experience of a Black man in America. And we sat down and watched Malcolm X. And I thought, well, if Caitlin can make it through this, maybe the rest of the marriage will be okay. And so, Caitlin, I think that's a tough way to meet the future in-laws. But she held, she was very gracious, and so that, I think my parents really appreciated that, that she was willing listen and understand that perhaps my experience and certainly my parents' experience had been different. You know, so I didn't really experience, they weren't upset, you know, but they were, you know, curious and wondering, you know, whether or not, I think they were also wondering whether or not her parents would accept me. And that was something that I was wondering about as well, because I think that when you are, you know, as, we've talked about this a lot lately. So you know, my experience is that most white people aren't, you know, racist, right? That's just my experience, that they're not sort of outwardly racist and disparaging towards blacks. But, you know, there's a large enough percentage of people who are, that as a black individual, you experience it relatively frequently. And so even though most white people are not, you never know when it's going to come up. And you also know that for a lot of parents, if it's not something that they've considered, right, their white child marrying a black individual, they may actually not know how they're going to respond. And so I was very curious to see how Caitlin's parents would respond, knowing that they weren't sort of outwardly, you know, racist or biased. And you know, the most important thing to them was faith and education. And that really came through quite quickly. And then there was a sort of period of getting to know each other. And it's been, I mean, I think the relationships just improved over time.
Yeah. Well, good job, Caitlin, for making it through Malcolm X. Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. Thank you for that response. And this has to do with kind of what do we do, which is a lot of people are asking, what do we do? And Bernard touched on it in his talk, but here's the question, how can we make this better? What actions can we take? Do we need to get involved in making political, legislative, or systemic change? Should we be protesting? So who wants to take a stab at that one first? You don't have to answer all those questions, but maybe part of one of those questions. Steve, what do you think?
Sean, I would start real simple right here. I'm going to simplify this. Invite me to dinner. Invite someone who has darker colored skin. If you don't know any black folks, go find one. Make a friend. Have them sit at your dinner table. Be hospitable and get to know who they are. Get to know the ins and outs and the nuances. Get to know the stories that they often have to tell their children about being out after dark at night if their skin is just too dark. So that's at the very simple level. And what does that do? It changes the disposition of your heart. And when your heart becomes transformed and disposed to an understanding and a greater level of empathy, then when you see an opportunity to vote a certain way, you'll go, oh, what is the justice? What is the true justice that I could vote for here that would serve? You know, you asked that question about protesting. So there were protests in downtown San Jose. I was not present. 3 sons were, along with other members of our church. I didn't know they were going to go. How did I find out? Facebook live feed. A friend was broadcasting. I went, there's my son. What the heck? Good for him. Because he stood up for what he believed was the right thing to do. There's a difference between being a protester and being a looter. But apparently some folks were not quite making that distinction. And the physical presence of being in the protest says, this matters to me. The March on Washington? If only 2 people showed up for Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, would it have been as great? Would we have heralded it as something fantastic? Maybe it would have just gotten printed in a book saying, you know, nice. But the fact of the thousands of people on the mall in Washington, D.C. made a statement. It said, there's a lot of people that care about this. They're willing to move their bodies and themselves out into a place and be seen in public as standing up for something. I think that's important.
Thanks, Steve. Daryl, do you have a response to this?
Yeah, so let me ask you though, are you talking specifically about white people or the church itself?
Um,
I mean, I can talk about both.
yeah. What the question didn't
get specific.
delineate. So
Yeah.
go ahead with whichever angle you want to go with.
I think for me, again, just working at this amazing institution, privileged white institution, and learning over the last couple of months, I think it's all about action. Just like Stephen said, and I think I said this earlier when we first started this conversation. Right now, I just think it's the step have been made. It's about creating a space where you can listen and learn and amplify voices. And I think that's what's so important, because when people say I have Black friends, I'm not a racist, I think that really frustrates me. And I'm saying that because if you have these folks in your life, and I know some amazing white cops, I know some amazing white friends, and I challenged them over the last 2 weeks. I held them accountable. Just because you say are you Black and you're my friend, but if you're quiet and silent, you're kind of reinforcing that behavior of white supremacists, you're reinforcing that behavior of inequities, you're reinforcing that behavior of what's going on in this country. So, my friend just called me tonight, and he says, I'm struggling with my whiteness. I'm struggling with this. He's a white guy, very privileged, and it was just so interesting. He called in tears and he wants to know what to do. And I said, you're starting off right now by even talking to me about this systemic racism, and I said, I'm gonna hold your space. I told him, I said, I will hold your space. I'm not going to exclude you. I'm going to include you in having these dialogues. So, I think it's all about measurable steps that we can see will make a difference. And this is a measurable step. I mean, the last couple of, but the first one was a measurable step. It's just amazing. And it was very interesting. I think a lot of people was struggling, being uncomfortable with this situation. And I like being uncomfortable. I like when people are uncomfortable. It just brings out the better person in you. And so I was talking to Rabbi about this. I asked him a question, just quickly. I asked him a question. I said, why is it so hard for the church to struggle with what's going on in this country, what's going on in terms of anti-racism? We just had this really cool conversation. I said, it's supposed to be the body of Christ. If you can't get this right in the body of Christ, it's almost like a false gospel. It's almost like it's a false gospel. We just going. It's easy to preach to individuals, and they have their testimonies. And it's not only white churches, it's Black churches too. So let me just put that out there. It's not just white, Black. It's all churches. It's so separated. And so I was just really, I just talked to Rabbi about this, and I'm so discouraged with the churches because, again, it's supposed to be the body of Christ, and we're not acting Christ-like. We acting like something else. So that's my take. That's my take.
Yeah. So take some steps, even baby steps, right?
It's not. It's small movement, not perfection.
Yeah. Thanks, Daryl. Chris and Caitlin, you have any thoughts on this question?
Well, I think that to echo everything that Steve and Daryl have said, for me, I had my eyes opened through the process of sitting at my future in-laws' dinner table and listening to my future father-in-law and future mother-in-law and many of their friends who grew up during the civil rights era just speak openly and honestly. And I my eyes were opened to racial inequities that I just could not have imagined through learning from a textbook. And so I think that the greatest work happens in the closest proximity, within your own home, when you welcome other people in and have the courage to share your own experiences, listening to my husband, my brother-in-law, listening to their experiences. And then, you have the greatest influence over other people who are in your orbit. So if you have friends and family who may need to be prodded, to sort of be challenged to think about how our Black brothers and sisters are being treated, maybe you need to have a difficult conversation with them. So I think that the greatest impacts happen in the closest relationships. We also have not attended any protests, and I think that I totally respect people who do, but we've had a lot of personal conversations with friends and family that God seems to be doing some amazing things through. So that's been our own personal experience.
And when we talk about protests, Steve mentioned it as well, violence and looting is obviously not what we're talking about with the protests. We can make that distinction. Violence and looting is off the table always, right? But peaceful protesting is okay, right? That is an okay thing to do. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, so absolutely. I think, there's I think we're sort of in uniform agreement that looting and violence is not appropriate. And, I do think that there's an attempt, there's a motivation in the media to sort of amplify messages on the far left and the far right for obvious, economic reasons. And if you dig deeper, you see that there are people on the right who are very supportive of, meaningful reforms that address inequities that affect Black people. And you look on the left and you see that there are many Black people who are speaking out against groups, opportunists that are using this moment for other political reasons, right? That aren't really about, the long history of racial inequality in the country, but, they see that there's a movement growing, and so they're going to attach their political motivations to it. And so that's not what we're talking about. But yeah, supporting the protests, we're absolutely in favor of. I think it's sort of hard to know like what we should do, because I think everybody is different, right? And so when I was going through, my own clinical training, and one of my supervisors, was advising me on how to talk to patients about like a treatment plan. Not that this is a treatment necessarily, but he said, find out where the patient is at and just get them to level up a little bit, right? And so if we're all different, we're all at different stages in our process of dealing with this. And so I think to figure out where you are and to identify what the next step would be, right? So for some individuals, that may mean, as Steve said, sort of abandoning the phrase "I'm colorblind," right? And saying, actually, let me take a close look at race. For others, it might mean really examining whether or not they're biased, and if they have, the ability to hire and fire people, thinking about whether or not they're actually fair in their assessment of Black candidates, right? Thinking about, what feelings go through your body when a Black person crosses your path on the street, right? So for each person, really getting in touch with where you are and trying to identify what the next step would be, I think that that's something that we should all be doing. And I think that, once again, it's not just a just a white issue. I think, we can be doing this on both sides. I think part of the problem with this conversation about race is that we want to dichotomize everything. I've said this before. We want to say it's white versus Black, and Steve's like, well, I'm mixed, and my children are mixed, right? And my mother's Honduran, actually. And so, you know, I don't think it makes sense to sort of dichotomize this along like racial lines. And I think within the Black community, sometimes we mistake, you know, someone being uninformed for someone being racist. And so I think that we also need to create space for people to explore questions of race without being prejudged as racist, right? If someone's willing to enter into that conversation, we should absolutely be willing to have that conversation with them. I don't think that anybody should feel guilty for being white, just like I don't want to feel guilty for being Black, right? But I think we have to realize that the experience of many Black individuals in this country is one of having been prejudged as being guilty, right? And so I think I think it's really important for people to understand that, as far as I can tell, that's a universal experience among Black people, basically being prejudged as guilty before you've done anything. And I won't go on too long, but I'll just say that, you know, when COVID hit, I realized that that feeling of wondering whether or not people were avoiding me because of my race went away, because everybody was worried about catching COVID from each other. And so everybody was avoiding each other on the street, right? And so I think if you think about your experience as someone who's not Black, right, walking down the street and having someone move away a couple feet or look at you, or if you have a little cough, wondering whether or not you're infectious. I mean, that's the lifelong experience of many Black individuals, right? And I think that's a way to really sort of internalize what that experience is like. And so I think, you know, the goal is just to try to take some of the claims of the Black community seriously. You know, it's not a figment of the Black community's imagination. And so if you take the claim seriously, figure out where you are in your own process and what the next step would be. That's
really helpful. You know, I try to jog a little bit, and it is interesting now, right? You don't pass each other on the sidewalk anymore.
Yeah.
You go out into the street to circle around someone when you're walking or jogging. So that's really helpful, that analogy. Yeah, self-examination, something we can all do and something we all should do. I want to go back to what you said, Chris, about engaging in these conversations, and that leads to the next question. How and where, as Christians, can we engage in these conversations of justice, these conversations of reconciliation? Where can we have these conversations? You know, it's pretty interesting that there aren't many forums to have these kinds of conversations in the public square. So where can we have these conversations besides something like here, besides in like our small groups, but like publicly, where can we have these conversations?
Well, I was just speaking, but I'll just say something, and this is maybe not an answer to where can we have these conversations publicly, but I do think that people who are not Black can have these conversations in places that Black people cannot, right? And so I know that growing up, you know, when we had Black families over, we would have conversations about race that we would not have when white individuals were present. And I presume that at times there are conversations about race that come up when Black people are not present, that wouldn't happen if Black people were present. And I think that there's an opportunity in those moments to actually speak to justice, to speak to racial equality, to really have that conversation in a place where a Black person might not be able to have that conversation.
Any other thoughts, Steve or Daryl or maybe Bernard? Where can we have these conversations?
No, I agree with Chris. I was just thinking about that. Growing up, we had these conversations about white people, and even today at the university, we have this, we're having these conversations, but there's a group of just white people are having these conversations about racism. And then there's the Black folks are having these conversations about racism. So I think it's been working for the last month and a half or 2 months. And it's just very interesting. Sometimes we both get together and talk about it. So and Sean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's, you're looking at in professional sports, they have these platforms and everybody's talking about it, not just Black athletes. There's people that's playing soccer, it's international. So I like what Chris just said. I was thinking about this. I just never had these conversations with other groups except for my race talking about white people. So I think that's a good start, just to, if you're a white person, just have it at your dinner table, have it at the dinner table with your kids, have it at the dinner table. I mean, if you're going out to eat, just talk about it. And I think that's planting that seed right there. That's a really, really good question.
Yeah.
I can plus one the answer to that question from Daryl. I have the privilege, and some of the brothers in this online discipleship are probably watching right now. So what we've chosen to do is to live stream our meetings and our transparency about trying to be men of God and wrestling major issues. So we do Tuesdays at 1:00, and we go live to YouTube, live to Facebook. We record it and we put it out in the public. Christian men wrestling with real issues, discussing, conversing.
That's powerful.
Wow.
That's powerful.
And Bernard, you'll know. Dr. Ernie's part of it. Bill Breck is another part of it. Janet Davis sometimes joins us. So it's free, right? You just need to gather the people. And we connect on Zoom, record it, much the same way that we're streaming this right now.
Great.
One last idea comes from my in-laws. They have been, ever since George Floyd's murder, they have been having informal conversations in the park, socially distanced, with other members in their homeowners association in their neighborhood. And so it's not a Christian crowd that they're talking with. And they said there's been a lot of really diverse response, because they're pulling, these are just people who happen to live near each other. And so anyway, so that takes cojones to do that, but they're doing it. So I don't know. I don't know how you would advertise that. Just pull up a picnic blanket and go sit on the grass. But that's one forum that they're using to talk to their neighbors.
Yeah. Bernard, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we are a little limited in our restrictions on us meeting in person, but there are a lot of books out right now on racial justice. At the first conversation, I looked and I pointed out that 8 of the top 10 New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction were on racial justice. So all over the country, there are book clubs, informal, gathering together to read all these books. And you've got to be a little more creative nowadays as to how you can do that. Perhaps on Zoom or in a park, if you're in a part of the country where that's suitable to meet outside in a park. So there's plenty of material to help read through, or watch one of the movies, watch Selma together and have a group, or if you have a club, a book club or discussion club, get a group of people together, you each watch Selma and then talk about it, or you each watch Just Mercy and talk about it, or 13th. So in a sense, there's a wealth of resources to learn, and then I just think all over the country, these informal groups are getting together to talk. And that's happening in churches. So Willow Glen Bible Church just had discussions working through 4 different books, meeting 3 times for each book, separate, spaced 2 weeks apart to work through that. So Steve will add one of those groups. Yeah, so there are opportunities, resources available to
help. Yeah, great. Okay, we have time for maybe two or three more questions. This question just came in, and it was addressed to you, Steve. How do you think we should teach children and uphold our founding fathers who had slaves, Washington, Jefferson, etc.? What are the things they did to build up our country?
Wow. Having given this some thought recently, let's separate out the civic duty of the man that we're talking about, which is how we regard them in their terms of their greatness towards contributions to this country. Their thinking was brilliant in most respects, setting down laws and setting down 3 branches of government. Look, we're all still here, 250 plus years later, 200 years later, we're still here. It works. Now, about their personal life and what they chose to do in other areas of life doesn't diminish the great work that they have done. So let me put it that way. Now let me put Jesus's hat on. I do believe he was hanging on a cross and he looked to his right and he said, I'll see you in heaven. I will see you in paradise, to a thief. He left the one on the left alone. Can we forgive? Does what the founding fathers did personally or how they conducted their private business, does that negatively affect what they did for us as a country? Can we separate out those two parts, or must they come together? And then we say the baby and the bathwater have to go out.
That's good. Anybody else have any thoughts on that one?
My God, I don't know, man. Just to be honest, I think when you talk about, I think the question was, how do you talk to your kids about the founding fathers? I have a good friend of mine, and she asked me that question, but she's 8, and she asked me that question, not exactly like that, but I don't know. I kind of told her, I said, I think the history books was manipulated a little bit too, and I was telling her this country was built on the backs of slaves. It wasn't built on the forefathers, the founding fathers, and all these things like that. It was built on the sweat and physical attributes of slaves. And she said, what she asked me, she said, I don't understand. We went to Burlingame Library and got some Black history books. She's still reading them. And you know what she told me? This is a 7-year-old about to be 8 in October. She said they lied to us.
Did you hear Steve's talk?
No, I did not.
That's amazing. Because Steve said the exact thing Steve said during his talk.
This is an 8-year-old kid goes to Roosevelt, and she said they lied.
She woke.
and so when you talk about the fathers and founding fathers and all that, I just think, again, people just have to be really, really, really honest.
Yeah.
Chance to learn, right? It's a chance to learn.
Get your white kids or any kid some Black history books.
Daryl, I think, just to be honest about it, that's really what I'm looking for, is the transparency. Can we just stop hiding what the founding fathers had done and quit treating them like they're like superheroes or something? They were remarkable men in many respects. They were despicable in other respects, and that makes them human. And God gave us grace for that.
And we shouldn't even judge those folks. We shouldn't judge those people. But at the same time, like you just said, you have to be honest about this, Steve. And these kids are smart today. They smart. They know something wrong. They know. Sorry.
All right. Well, we'll run out of time. So let me give you one more question. What does the Black community really want from us?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question.
And you know, not that you speak for the whole Black community, right? But
Well,
just what are some thoughts?
That's mainly the point. So recent dinners with Black friends had this conversation. And could you just listen for a minute and hear me? It's just the desire to be heard. It's the desire for there to be a societal recognition that there is something systemically wrong in the way that police forcing is done if disproportionately Black men are being shot to death. You know, it just doesn't quite make sense, because statistically it shouldn't be that way. So you have to begin to say, can we just admit that there's something wrong, and then we can work together? But when we continue to deny, like we were just talking about, if we keep saying, oh, there's nothing systemically wrong here, those are just isolated incidences. There's not 400 years of isolated incidences. This is an avalanche. And
No,
we're
it's a
going to
good
get
point.
crushed.
You know, I was talking to a friend of mine about this recently. He's a white guy who's not from America. And he said, you know, I think we have to look at each of these police incidents in isolation. And I said, but if you look in isolation, you'll never see a pattern.
No.
In the pattern is the lived experience of many Black Americans, right? It's a pattern of interactions outside of our racial group. And so, you know, what does the Black community want? We're diverse. I mean, so yes, I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that there is a shared desire for the country to acknowledge that there is differential treatment, right? To just do it, just at least sort of acknowledge that there's differential treatment, and that differential treatment was legislated in the past, and that we continue to experience the effects of racist legislation, even though there's no racist legislation today, right? That informs our current circumstances. In that acknowledging that, rather than trying to explain it away as isolated cases, will at least make the Black experience in America validated. It will help validate that experience for us. You know, whereas oftentimes we're made to sort of feel as if we're being overly sensitive, or it's all in our heads, or we're making it up. And you do wonder that sometimes. And you're like, well, was that incident due to my race, or was that due to something else? But once again, when you look at a pattern, you do realize that there is differential treatment. And for if we could all just acknowledge that, I think that would take us a long way.
I get that. I get that question all the time. And just briefly, it's like, I really don't want anything from white people. I just want to be treated fairly.
Yeah.
That's all it is. Like Chris was just saying, it's simple to me. It's like, just treat me as a human being. And Doc Rivers just said this, just blew my mind. He said, white folks have been trying to love this country for so long, and this country don't love us back. This is crazy. We love this country, but it don't love us back. And so when you talk about, I don't want white people to think that we want a handout. We don't want a handout. We just want to be treated fairly and not judged by our skin versus our character and our intellect. And I think that's where we're missing the boat.
Yeah, I heard it put like this, and I'll just say this, and you guys can respond. We don't want to be put on a pedestal or to be treated like children. We simply are asking for the opportunity to have the freedom to pursue the things we know this country was built to pursue.
That's well said.
Dang. Mic drop.
I thought that was pretty well said, but I wanted to throw it out to you and see what you thought.
Yeah.
Can't say nothing to that.
All right.
Got it, man.
Well, I that's not my quote. It's I have to give credit to another person, but anyway, once again, we're out of time, and I'd love to just keep talking with all of you. It's such a privilege to spend time with you. And once again, Daryl, Chris, Caitlin, thanks for coming back and joining us again. It's such a privilege. Steve, thanks for your time, sharing your heart with us tonight. Bernard, thanks for your teaching again. If anything came up in tonight that you want to talk to a pastor, please feel free to give us a call or email us. Thank you all for tuning in. And just like we've been saying, this is a continuing conversation. And we want to have another one around the end of October. So you can look for the information on that as we get closer. Well, let me just pray and thank the Lord for this time. Well, Father, Son, and Spirit, Lord of all, in your grace and mercy and compassion, you raise the poor from the dust. You lift the needy from the ash heap. You settle the barren woman in her home. You uphold the cause of the oppressed. You give food to the hungry. You set the prisoner free and give sight to the blind. You watch over the foreigner and sustain the orphan and widow. You draw near to the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds. So now we pray that you would open our eyes to see the misery you see. Open our ears to hear the cries you hear. Open our hearts to weep where you are weeping. And open our lives to love with the love of Christ, who being in the very nature God, made himself nothing. Taking the very nature of a servant, he humbled himself to death on a cross. Lord, teach us to be salt and light in this world. Amen. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week.
Amen.